Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Marcus Vincent and Mark Bilby, and we're going to continue our quest through 2 Corinthians. If you missed the last episode, do go back and check it out on the channel. But without further ado, Marcus, take it away with 2 Corinthians 7.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jack, for the introduction. As you said before we started the recording, by the week I get more excited about the canonical Paul, or let's put it in a more negative term, I get more and more annoyed with him, because I think, as we will see today, when you read these two versions in parallel, you can hardly understand how it came about that from a discursive kind of letter, rather a discursive lecture, a kind of a homily has been made and put into the frame of a letter, which is in parts so weird. I just had a look again at 1 Corinthians, and even there, colleagues were suggesting that it is a conglomeration of different letters which have been compounded together. But in 2 Corinthians, as just the conference showed to me when I was in Leuven a few weeks ago, there is no scholarly agreement whether this is 1 letter or whether it is a conglomerate of 5 letters. Now, today we will see that one of the solutions might be the one we suggest here on this channel, is that what sounds like a different letter is just the move from the pre-canonical text to the canonical version, and the material which somehow sound as being bolted on the earlier letter is indeed the reductional part, or the reductional parts, which potentially didn't come from one hand. So they even sound sometimes differently to each other, but they are part of a reductional makeup. And we can, when we read these 2 versions side by side, we can even sometimes detect, which I will show you, how the reductors themselves are knowing what they are doing. They are even defending what they are doing, and they are already putting the pre-canonical author or the pre-canonical reductor into the negative, so to play on them and to theological also rectify what they're doing. Now, when we have the pre-canonical text on the left side, we are using today Mark Bilby's new translation, which I tell you, you have to buy because it's the fantastic book. It's the final version, at least for the next days, and which will be a great reading on a Sunday. I think you get the better homilies out of the pre-canonical version than on the canonical one. I promise you. I have already colleagues who started saying, well, now the readings are easier, and the homilies as well, because they have now a clear Paul instead of the mess what we are used to. Now, here we have got an enormous gap. We have a text which starts in 7:1 and jumps into chapter 11. I just give you the jump. So here we have, let us cleanse ourselves from pollution of flesh and of blood. And then we have 11. A chaste virgin to present to the Christ. So once we have cleansed flesh and blood, what is left is a chaste virgin. And of course, a chaste virgin here is just an image because it refers to men and women. So it is this kind of imagery where you present to Christ a spiritual being, which is a chaste, which means an ascetic being. And we have learned earlier in 1 Corinthians 7 that people have gifts to be either unmarried like Paul, that's the best way to be, or if they are married, they have to be non-sexually related to and within their marriage. So whatever you are, what are you going to present is to be a chaste virgin. And this is what you present to Christ. And this is to Christ here, but even more so, it is to the heavenly Christ. So this is the way salvation works. A clear, simple text, but a big, big stumbling block, of course, for the canonical redactors. Why? Well, already in 1 Corinthians 7:1, the alterations have taken part because, yes, they're not denying chastity, they're not denying ascetics and asceticism. However, what Marcion had suggested, and if we are right, he is only moderating what kind of asceticism was present in early Christians and in early Christian circles. So even what Marcion suggested in his letters of Paul was unacceptable. And I think for very good reasons. None of us would be here if Marcion had been followed, because the whole generations of Christians had died out. So great that the canonical redactors did something to this Pauline letter complex and allowed marriage to happen, flourishing of Christianity, and no world religion would be with Marcion's texts. However, the downside to this type of an alteration is that they had a lot to do, to reject this kind of radical asceticism, and also to make up a institutionalizing of Christianity, as we will see it here on the go in what happens in between chapters 7 and 11. So let's go back to 7. And we will see quickly what they do here. So having then these, the promise, beloveds, let us cleanse ourselves from all pollution of flesh and of spirit, completing sanctity in fear of God. We had already noticed in the chapters before that what has been said in a rather discursive way in the Marcion text had become already a moral advertising or a moral homily in chapters 5 and 6, and that's being continued here. And it's very interesting to see that already the pollution of flesh and of blood, and of course Marcion had insisted that this is a pollution of what is human, and human is being flesh and blood, whereas the spirit is not polluted. The spirit is the one that is being presented. That's the chaste virgin. And you can see that's one of the reasons why the canonical redactors here are doing the more Platonic dichotomy between flesh and spirit. Having said that, across the canonical Paul, there is the insistence that it is to do with the Spirit, and mostly it's to do with the Holy Spirit. So how the Spirit here fits in is not completely clear. A kind of an inconsistency, I think, of the redactors. And you can see here straight away we have a run into a moral adhortation. Make space for us. It's not quite clear what us here means. No one did we wrong. No one did we corrupt. No one did we defraud. You wonder what's going on here. Who has suggested that Paul wasn't given space? We've read through 7 chapters. Who had suggested that what he was writing was wrong? Who had suggested that this Paul was corrupting what he is saying and produced defraud? And I think this can only make sense if you read it, that the redactors are here speaking about themselves. People who have read and knew about the pre-canonical text, they must have thought, come on, what's going on with this text here? 4 new chapters. Where are they from? Why should we make space for so much nonsense? What's coming on? And here they fend off, I think, those kind of suggestions and are rectifying the way they're working. Namely, they are broadening the text, they are doing wrong. So they know that what they are doing is not only plagiarism, is fraud, is corruption of a text. Unto condemnation I speak not. So he's speaking, because nobody condemns because the people are not speaking. I mean, they're writing against the wall here. For I have pre-said that in the hearts of ours you are, in order to co-die and to co-live. Much frankness mine unto you, much confidence mine over you. I've been filled with the consolation. I'm superabounding in the joy upon all the affliction of ours. You will quickly see he has reminiscences of this trust into sorrow, which started the whole letter off. But it becomes more and more now a biographical self-reflection, which disguises what this text is doing to the pre-text on which it is crafted. Now becomes the whole biographical stuff. For also after we came to Macedonia, the flesh of ours had no relaxation, instead being afflicted in all, from outside fights, from inside fears. Again, if we take that not as a historical picture of Paul, but of a reflection, what carries on in the school of the redactors, then we can see what was going on at the time. Macedonia, I think it is between Thessalonica and Ephesus and Smyrna. That's what's going on, and that's where all this happens here. But not only in the rival of his, instead also in the consolation by which he was consoled upon you, declaring to us the yawning of yours, the lamentation of yours, the rivalry of yours on my behalf, so then for me to be even more joyous. I think this might still be a reflection how people were dealing with the first Paul and how they tried to work on this. For I also pained you in the letter. I do not regret, even if I did regret, for I see that the letter that won, even if for an hour it pained you. Now I rejoice not that you were pained, instead that you were pained into repentance. Also this letter, people had, I mean, there is legion of literature on which kind of a letter he's speaking about. And potentially it is the pre-canonical Pauline text that he's here talking about, maybe the entire collection, because the singular letter quite often means a plural of letters. Now I rejoice not that you are pained. Yeah, for the God-based pain produces repentance for salvation, unrepenting, but the pain of the world produces death. So it's all about what they do to this letter. If our interpretation is correct, it is needed because it creates pain in the community. Yeah, but this is what the community has to do at that time, or the school rather. For behold, this same, that being pain based on God, produced in you how much haste, instead defense speech, instead indignation, instead fear, instead yawning, instead rivalry, instead vindication. In everything you commended yourselves to be pure in the matter. So then, even if I wrote to you, neither for the sake of the wrongdoer, nor for the sake of the one wronged, instead for the sake of being manifested the haste of yours, that for us unto you before the God. Maybe that is also a reflection that people were pained by this ascetic text of the Pauline letters. And if you want to have a reflection about these debates that are going on between schools and within schools, we mentioned that earlier. You only need to look into the letter collection of which Eusebius gives us a summary, and that is Dionysius of Corinth, when he writes to Pinotus in Crete. And Pinotus is one of these ascetic people who followed, I think, the ascetic Paul, whereas Dionysius of Corinth wants a kind of a Paul that is being created here for the first time in the school of Polycarp. So due to this, we have been consoled. Yeah, atop the consolation of ours, we rejoiced even more exceedingly on the joy of Titus, because he has been given rest the spirit of his by all of you. For if anything, To him over you have I boasted. I was not ashamed. Instead, also all things in truth we spoke to you. So also the boast of ours that on Titus became truth. Well, the emphatic depths of his are more exceedingly for you, as he recalls the memory, the obedience of you all, as with fear and trembling you received him. The mention of Titus is quite interesting here, because he is the only person, the only co-worker that is being named in the pre-canonical collection. So you can see if the interpretation is correct. The people who are talking here are talking about this kind of a cross-reference. And they bring in Titus now being pulled to their side. I rejoice that in everything I take courage in you, but we make known to you, brothers, the favor of the God that has been given to the assemblies of Macedonia. That's the beginning now of chapter 8. So we had this rumbling with excuses being made and the pains being taken and the suffering that was the affliction here. Why the letter now gets new chapters and new, not just small chapters, big chapters. It didn't say anything what the chapters are about, but you will see in the next 2 chapters, it's all about money. It's money grabbing. It's the hope that people are putting the means together. Now, Mark made a remark, and you can make it yourself because you've got the text by Badun in front of you.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that Badun makes a really helpful observation here. If you have his first New Testament, it's in the end notes, particularly on 2 Corinthians 7:2 to 11:1. I'll just read it real quick, and then we'll take a look at a resource that patristic scholars use to evaluate patristic testimonies of Scripture from what's called the Bible Index. So it's put together by a large group of researchers in France based on the many projects that are at home in France on patristic editions. But Badun says in the end note, Tertullian says nothing about a large gap occurring here between 2 Corinthians 7:2 to 11:1. He says nothing about a large gap in Marcion's version of the letter or the Catholic version of the letter. But it should be noted that in his works, Tertullian has an unusual absence of quotations from this very part of the letter. For most of Paul's letters, he quotes several passages from each chapter, but he shows a conspicuous void here with no quotations or allusions to anything between 7:10 and 10:2. It is, here's Badun's words, it is a striking anomaly that stands out in any index of his scripture references. And just to buttress that, we like to trust but verify. Jack will bring up the Bible Index screenshot here that I just quickly pulled this from the Bible Index site. I think it'll be coming up soon. And I used the Bible Index back in the day when I was doing research on the reception history of the Lucan crucifixion. And it's a great resource because it points you to a lot of legitimate citations, but it's also, I would say 20 to 30, maybe 40% of the time, it overly indexes. That is, it's claiming citations that aren't actually there. So a few different things, just taking a very quick look at this list, you see quotation after quotation or citation after citation for chapter 6, and then 7:1 right at the beginning. And then all of a sudden, a leap to 8:9, and then a leap to 10:3. I just went and looked up the reference that it's ostensibly making to De Patientia, the on patience, and it's a bogus reference. There is no reference to 2 Corinthians 8:9 at all. So that's illegitimate. I haven't looked into the one to 2 Corinthians 10:3 yet, looking at the critical edition, but we're just basically buttressing and supporting what Badun pointed out here. There is a massive gap, even in the canonical text. And that, Marcus has brought this up many times before, and I'm seeing it more and more. The evidence is that the canonical redaction isn't just happening at one stage. It's happening over multiple rounds, maybe 2 rounds or 3 rounds. So Tertullian may well have had a canonical 2 Corinthians that did not have chapters 8 and 9, all the financial language. And just to buttress to what and support what Marcus was just saying, sometimes there are nuances in Greek that don't always come out in English. I've tried to bring out a lot of the commercial or financial connotations in the translation, but sometimes there are sort of subtexts and you have to just read carefully. For instance, the word simplicity, we just came across it, haplatitas. That's a word that could also be translated generosity, right? And in ancient Greek and Hebrew thought, to have a simple mind, have a simple perspective, means that you're generous. You have like a single eye. You're not conniving. You're not trying to extort money out of people. You're just generous in a simple way. So what I translated as simplicity there, again, could be generosity, which just reinforces all of the very overt financial language being used here.
Yeah, following up on that, what is so interesting is that I noticed, or we noticed, and also when we did the reconstruction of the Pauline letters, 10-letter collection, that particular chapters, like here, chapters 8 and 9, and potentially also 10, were not only absent as late as Tertullian's works. So it's not just in the works against Marcion, it's across his works. But the same, we can say, is absent for the time before Irenaeus. And this is also quite an interesting fact, that when you look into the people who have studied the reception of Paul, you will see it's not just chapters 8 and 9. It is also Romans 15 and 16. It is also 1 Corinthians 16. It is also the book of Acts. And it is also the pastoral letters. Now, in all of these writings that I've just mentioned, one of the core features is the collection. It is this money exercise that is being advocated in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 and hinted in 10. So the entire enterprise, which is linked to getting the money from Macedonia and from other places to render that money as a collection for the church in Jerusalem, seen by scholars until very recently, and we have multiple big monographs on the money collection of Paul, being seen as a genius precursor of any type of money collection of Jews. From the Tannites, we know that towards the end of the second century, Jews started collecting money not in the same big way as it's being described here, but there is a new kind of collection that is being instigated. Why? Because after the First Jewish War, the fiscus was diverted from the temple to the Roman money box. Now, Jews who continued to live also in Palestine and in the diaspora wanted to come back and go back to their charity business. And so they started their money collection again. But here we are told almost 120, 150 years earlier, Paul was the inspiration for this type of a Jewish money collection. At least two major problems with that, or three. One I've mentioned, absence of information about this money collection prior to Irenaeus. Now we can all say, well, that's typically argumentum from silence, doesn't count at all. So discredit this one. Second, why, if it was so important, and Paul organized across the Mediterranean area a money collection that substantiated and helped the Jerusalem community, despite the fact that at that time, Christians were still Jews, there was a charity collection going on. So we have the fiscus judaicus, people paid to the temple, paid to the community. So why another collection for a community that's being supported already? But more problematic is, why don't we have one single word for the drying out of that collection after Paul, particularly in the time when no money went to the temple because the temple was destroyed and the money went to Rome. There is not one single line of any author that pities or complains about a collection that does no longer exist. We have no historical information from any of our patristic fathers who say, oh, what a pity, this wonderful stream of money that reached from all around the Mediterranean through the channel of Titus and of others and their followers, Jerusalem, and supported each other. No information. If this had been a historical precursor, which then 120 years, 150 years later is being picked up by the Jewish neighbors, all the more you would have expected that the Christians, Melito, Irenaeus, who you name them, would have said, oh, it's a real pity, this fantastic organization that we had, well established by this champion of organization, Paul, somehow has been dried out or has been killed, or who are the responsible people who didn't carry on with that? Nothing, simply nothing. So I think it is more likely that, as with these chapters that are unknown to anybody prior to Irenaeus, and even sometimes not known to people after Irenaeus, that these chapters have come in with what we call the second canonical reduction, which is around the time of Irenaeus. And it was to portray Paul in a different way than the Paul that is being portrayed in the 10-letter collection. It is now a Paul which features, as he is being painted by Acts, as the missionary, the organizer, the center of finance, but also somebody who submits himself and with him all the communities that relate to him, to the brothers in Jerusalem. So I think what they have done, this canonical reductors, is what they have usually done. They pick up stuff which is in the air. So they knew of the Jewish community that start these kind of money collection and make it even grander as something Paul has initiated over 100 years before.
To add to that, I think while it makes no sense historically for Paul to have engaged in this massive fundraising endeavor all over the Mediterranean to bring it back to Jerusalem, it makes very little sense in a historical context, except to try to reinforce the idea that Paul is devoted to temple worship. That which is a high priority for Acts. Paul submits repeatedly to procedures in temple worship, even a purification ritual by shaving his head so that he can re-enter the temple, which is kind of bizarre. That's a topic for another episode. But so while it makes little sense, except in terms of Acts agenda, I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of a late 2nd century, early Orthodox or early Roman primacy sort of view, right? If you particularly put it in the context of Marcion having given a massive donation to the church in Rome, right? As the legends say, if we take that as having some historical substance to it, then essentially Paul outdoes Marcion before Marcion, right? Paul becomes this massive fundraising, massively generous, organizing, successful, apostle even before Marcion does. And when he does have this generous gift, he gives it to the mother church in Jerusalem, not to benefit himself. But we might be looking around the late 2nd century is around the time when the martyr shrines of Peter and Paul really start to appear in the archaeological record, at least. So this is interesting too, to tie this big fundraising campaign to the initialization of the martyr shrines of Peter and Paul in Rome, making Rome the center. So in that case, the offering for Jerusalem is really an offering for Rome, right? Rome being the new Jerusalem in this case, right? It's the new center of the Christian faith within this campaign. Marcus, do you think that has any merit, that sort of analysis?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. Yeah. I would even add one layer, because what people are writing, if we are not mistaken, in the late 2nd century, is what people opt for. They are writing these elements to create also, like the Tannains, so like the Jewish brothers, yeah, they like to install some kind of charity business. And that's why, for example, for the first time, words like diaconia, diacony, or charity work come in. These words are not present in the pre-canonical text. And we have nice volumes by Bart Coed on deacons and deaconesses and diaconia. And they clearly show, for example, whenever Justin, and he only mentions deacons once or twice, yeah, whenever he mentioned those, he always says the so-called deacons. So it's not something which is already in the vocabulary of these people. It's new. So it's a whole new business that's being started. And I think it is a push to create people financing the growing institution. And don't forget, we have a banker who becomes one of the bishops at the end of the 2nd century in Rome. So there is this financialization, and the same financialization you have across the canonical redaction in the Gospels, but also in the Catholic letters. See the criticism, for example, also for finance in the book of James, yeah. But with all this criticism, it's still a focus. Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, yeah, he criticizes this person for being greedy. Acts starts with greediness and the question that people should pull their stuff together and should put it in front of the feet of the apostles. People don't do it. Yeah, people are greedy. So that's the debate that's going on, I think, towards the end of the 2nd century, and that filters into our canonical redaction.
I want to shoehorn, most awkwardly, a question that's come up a few times in our community, and I'm trying to think of the best way to make it as least awkward as possible. But I suppose we might say that if one were to take the traditional consensus that Marcion is tampering, then why would he dislike such a collection going to the east, to Jerusalem, and why would he remove it? And the awkward question I want to add in there then is, people are asking a lot in the comments and in Discord, was Marcion a Jew? And was he a Jewish sympathizer? And I suppose the link then that I'm going to tangentially draw between those two things is that if he was a Jew, though not necessarily from Jerusalem or Israel wider, would he have had any affinity or affection or love for that region? See how I've very awkwardly tried to tie those two things
I
together?
think I've once written an article in the first volume of Christianity and Judaism, or Judaism Christianity, or Judaism Antique, I think it's the name. It's the journal that Mimumi has published and edits. And because he is working always on Jewish Christianity and Christian Jews. And that article I gave the title Marcion the Jew. And I didn't do that deliberately or just pulling it from the air. First of all, Adolf Harnack was of the opinion that Marcion had been a Jew. And as so often, I think he was right in this. First of all, we don't have anybody in the first hundreds of years who quotes the Septuagint, who knows the Septuagint, who quotes it as extensively as any Jew does. You might say Celsus sometimes refers to it, but that's peanuts compared to what we get in Marcion or in our canonical gospel, or even in Marcion's gospel and in Paul's letters. That was for Bedouin, for example, an argument to disqualify Marcion as an author of this text, but it presupposes already a picture of Marcion, which is a removed one, a non-Jewish one. Now, when you look into how Tertullian describes Marcion, and that's where Hannah came from, he mentions several times that he is a kind of a proselyte. So he seems to be in a Jewish community. And if we then think that the Jewish community of Sinope at the time, so the city where Marcion comes from, that this was a center of Jewish learning, where, for example, the Septuagint has been rewritten and corrected. So it is a center of learning, of literature, of Greek Judaism, of proselytism. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why we have to make those links. Yeah. And then the question, why would he remove that? I mean, he's a businessman. I don't know of any businessman who doesn't want to have some kind of contributions being made by others.
It's also, this kind of echoes Bedun's point about Marcion. If you buy the, evisceration, abridgment theory, then Marcion is quite an inept editor, because in the gospel, wealth and poverty are a very regular emphasis all the way through, right? Jesus's initial proclamation that the beggars are blessed, the rich are cursed, all the way through Zacchaeus, right? You just get teaching after Dives and Lazarus. You get teaching after teaching after teaching that's focused on wealth and poverty and on the importance of generosity and on the sort of an eschatological inversion where the poor are the blessed ones. Why does that financial emphasis just completely disappear then from the Apostolos? Why is it all over the place in the Evangelion, and completely all the financial concerns are just absent from the Apostolos? It just doesn't make any sense, except for the source materials coming from different contexts, I would say. And in that case, not a heavy-handed, consistent editorial hand all the way across the collection in that regard, at least.
Yeah, I would agree. Although I would say there is one consistency between the two collections, between the Gospel and the Pauline letters. And that is that there is no inheritance of any physical stuff. So money, you're right. People have always noticed, and I think that's across the board of New Testament scholars, that Luke is the gospel, and hence the Marcionite gospel behind, as you say. Yeah. So it's the Evangelion, which is the most financial-oriented gospel of all the four canonical ones. Now, this is an interesting fact. However, it is equally true that despite this emphasis on finances and on money in the Gospel of Luke, it is not to get money, but to get rid of money, to be ascetic. So wealth is not the issue. It's not a gospel of wealth. It is a gospel, as you rightly called it once, it's a gospel of poverty. So it's all about getting rid of this bloody money you have. And I think that was one of the major concerns for Marcion. He was known and he's ridiculed when you read the report, for example, of this presbyter that's being used in Irenaeus. He makes Marcion a laughingstock because of his wealth. And I think that must have been a major concern. Now, in Luke, in the Beatitudes, we only have, blessed is the one who is poor. Now, why is he blessed? Does he get rich? No, he doesn't get rich. He earns, or he becomes or gets the kingdom of heaven. So spirit is the only richness that is being promised by Marcion and in Marcion's gospel. Quite contrary to Matthew. Blessed are the poor, Matthew says, because they inherit the land. Oh, great. That's where we are still in Gaza today. Inheritance of land. So the fight for the material stuff Yeah. And that's the big difference. So yes, it is a gospel of wealth, but I would say more properly it's a gospel of poverty, or how to get people to commit everything they have. And again, not for a collection, not for a community, not that other people are being so supported. Yeah. No, for getting rid of what hinders you. And that brings us back to 2 Corinthians. So it's all about flesh and blood being cleansed from all material and also from all material wealth to provide Christ a chaste virgin. Naked, nothing on it, just what we are. When you then read chapters 8, and I'm happy to quickly read through it, the rest which we haven't done. So we have Titus here as the only co-worker of pre-canonical Paul, and now we carry on a bit further down because we've done the first verses already. Okay, from 11. But presently also you must complete the doing, so that as was the readiness of the planning, so also the completing from the having. Quite really reflected people who know how to get organized, and you can see a school behind. You can see what this whole project of the new letter collection is about. For if the readiness is preset, as much as one may have is acceptable, not as much as one does not have, the contrary to Marcion. Not so that for others rest for you affliction instead of equality. In the present moment, the surplus of yours for the deficit of theirs, so you have all the money connections here, so that also the surplus of theirs may be for the deficit of yours, so then there may be equality. As it has been written, you or he having the much did not overabound, and the having the little did not have too little. But favor to the God who gave to the same haste on your behalf in the heart of Titus. For though he received the consolation, yet more hasty originating, self-initiated, he left unto you. But we sent along the brother with him, of whom the praise in the Evangelium throughout all the assemblies. But not only that, instead, who also has hand-elected by the assemblies co-travelers of ours together with a favor, this which is being ministrated by us unto the glory of the same Lord and readiness of ours. And you can see it's not just the project of these letters, it's the Evangelion together with the letters. I think this is a whole project which is in the background of this chapter. Who were enjoying this one, lest anyone fault us in the substantiality, this which is being ministrated by us. For we pre-plan virtuous things not only before Lord, instead also before humans. But we have co-sent with them the brother of ours, whom we evaluated often in many things as being hasty, but now much more hasty in great confidence that in you, either for Titus, my partner and co-worker, and you can see how he's being highlighted, yeah, as the reliable chap for this organization. Our brothers, apostles of assemblies, glory of Christ. Thus the evidence of the love of yours and of our boasting on your behalf to them, evidencing in presence of the assemblies. For while about the ministration that the saints, excessive for me is the writing to you. For I have known the readiness of yours, which I boast over you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was prepared from a year ago, and the rivalry of yours provoked the many. But I sent the brothers, lest the boasting of ours that over you be emptied in the portion, this that men may be prepared, as I said, and so forth. You see, you better read it by yourselves. It's a rumbling around, and it carries on. In most virtuous terms, yeah, so that you sow sparingly, but you get the full blessing. And this is not a blessing in heaven. This is the blessing in dinars, in money, also in the rituals and so forth. And it carries on to the revelation of the ministration, is glorifying the God over the subjection of the confession. And by their petition for you, they who yearn for you due to the super exceeding favor of the God upon yours, favor to the God for the unnarratable bounty of his. And that comes now a strong Pauline self-statement that I myself, Paul, summon you by the mildness and fairness of the Christ, I who in person throw lowly among you, but being away am bold toward you. I petition, and so forth. You can see it's almost unbearable to read that. And I agree with Jack, the more I have to read this stuff, the more I have difficulties. And then we end and come back to chapter 11. So, oh, that you would tolerate of me a little something of folly. Instead, indeed, you are tolerating me. You can see, again, I think this is a notion where the redactors are reflecting on how it might be in the eyes and the ears and the hearts of the people who have to digest what's just being said in front of them. And it is a folly, I think, that they admit, although they project that, of course, onto the pre-canonical text. And they admit, yes, we have tolerated them. I mean, I didn't read through all of that, but we are tolerant. Yeah, so it's in the canon, but it's terrible, I think. He says, I'm jealous for you with God's jealousy. And you know, jealousy of God is exactly what Marcion rejected. For I betrothed you to one man, a pure virgin, to present to Christ. So you can see how all of that has been watering down this very short sentence that ascetic people should present themselves bare of everything to Christ. At least they admit and say, oh, they are afraid. Lest someone as the serpent led astray Eve in the craftiness of his, he might corrupt the thoughts of yours from the simplicity that for Christ. I think that's probably the most honest statement in this letter of the canonical redactors. They are what they are, serpents who lay the people astray and who corrupted a text, which was a beautiful text, but which has become a pretty unbearable poison. And then they carry on. If one who comes preaches another Jesus, that's exactly what they do. Who we did not preach, it's exactly what happened. It wasn't preached. Or you receive another spirit, precisely. That's what the people get. And that you did not receive. No, we didn't. Or another Evangelion, you can see, again, letters of Paul and the Evangelion, and they admit what is in this canonical New Testament is at best virtuously to tolerate. Yeah, I think we are, I mean, at least I'm done with these two chapters for now. And I think next time I will come with a very broad, tolerant mind. We will come to the end of these two chapters to then dive into an even more boasting and more intelligent, I have to say, but probably a more distorting letter that is the comparison of Romans.
If I could add a few stylistic observations here. If you've got the Greek-English version, these are easier to do. I tried to make it easier than most translations with certain translation choices. So there are various prefixes in that whole section that just keep repeating again and again. So the soon prefix in verb after verb after verb. Sometimes this is isolated with the co, and then a hyphen. Sometimes it's in words like compare, right? But just keep an eye out, whether you're reading the English or the Greek. Look at every time the co starts a word in that section. Highlight it, right? But then do the same across the whole canonical collection. And then look at the Marcionite collection and notice like the Marcionite collection has very little soon language, and it's everywhere in the canonical text. But it's not only that, they tend to stack up very quickly. And the same thing with pra. You see pro in various places here. You see huper, which is like super, exceeding. So it's not just financial language that is distinct. And I think also just where deliberate choices in the translation can help bring some of this out, because there are words that get spiritualized. For instance, koinonia. It's a popular term among evangelicals to say fellowship, right? Here, it's not fellowship in some chummy sense, right, of people getting together. It's partnership. It's a shared business arrangement that's happening among these people. So as you go through the translation, whether you buy it or not, or if you're just watching, in these free videos, pay attention to those little details, because it's in those little tiny stylistic details, as well as the big macro picture, that you start to see just two very different trajectories, two very different texts. And again, it just doesn't make sense that Marcion came in and somehow changed the entire style of a composition, when the style is quite clean and just not meandering and not just piling up expression after expression. That you get the sense in the canonical text that whoever's writing this is really just being very playful, deliberately playful, by stacking up all these very similar stylistic phenomena one after the other, whether it's the word metra, metch for measure, or co or pra, or ex, or huper, or whatever. You see this continual like clustering and stacking of these micro features within this text. So on that,
Yeah.
it doesn't make it any less depressing, but at least it makes it more like scientifically interesting, maybe.
Maybe just a word to this. It is so interesting because that has helped us to define the way or the direction of reworking. If, as you just said, if a redactor had taken the canonical text and produced the small or the smaller text of the pre-canonical version, he would not even have needed to leave chapters aside, like chapters 8 and 9 in 2 Corinthians. He would have needed to purge all the verses that he has taken on board, by getting rid of these syn combinations. Of course, we could say, yes, any kind of surgical redactor is capable of doing it. So that we have to admit. But now comes what is impossible. And the impossibility, and that is the decisive factor, the impossibility is that the canonical reduction has only made use of this style with the syn and the pro and the con in the verses which are added to the pre-canonical verses. They have not introduced this type of style in those verses which they have taken on straight in parallel. So this is why we so often switch style from, even when you just read the canonical text, you switch style from those verses which are parallel to Marcion's text, where all these features are missing. And they are not only missing in Marcion's text, they are also missing in those parallel texts which are embedded in the canonical text. And this is impossible, because a writer could and would not switch style only to have the style in those texts which are outside of Marcion's text. Why would he do that? Impossible to do. So this is not a gradual thing. It is a decisive factor. And that's the reason why New Testament scholars can no longer, if they're scientific, can no longer believe that the Pauline canonical text is prior to Marcion's text.
It's also the case that there are still long words and prefixed words in the Marcionite text. They just tend to start with meta or appa,
Hypo.
right? So hupo, right? Hupo, appa, meta. We see it right here, actually, in 11, 13, and 14. Meta occurs twice in close proximity. So language of transformation, language of separation, language of subjugation, that's all very well present in the Marcionite edition, but none of the co-language, none of the or very minimal huper language, and all these sorts of, it's just a very different style between the two. So, yeah.
And if the canonical text had been earlier, you would find these specifically canonical style also in all verses, and not just in the additional texts.
Well, there we go. As always, please do subscribe to Patristica, and despite what Mark said, do go out and buy the book, link down in the description below. As always, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.